Well, first of all, I think I'm on the clip-on mic. It's a delight to be with you over this weekend and this morning, and I bring greetings from my church at St Matthew's, Kensington, in the Diocese of Adelaide. My wife Fiona and I have been able to come up for the weekend, and we've enjoyed not only warmth for us, this is actually quite a warm day compared to what Adelaide's been experiencing, but especially getting to hear a number of your stories and to recognise how God is at work in such a diverse range of ways. It is so encouraging. So both Fiona and I thank you for your welcome and extend our greetings. I also bring the greetings of my Archbishop Jeff Smith, who never ceases to stop reminding me that Brisbane is the centre of Australia and of all things climate-wise. He still misses the warmth of Brisbane. And I'll have to tell him, yes, you're right. Brisbane has delivered. Over this weekend, we have been reflecting on that desire that God would be reviving us, renewing us, bringing us back into a space in which we can be drawn into, if you like, the tailwind of God's movement. And there is a strong sense that God is on the move. Now, God is always active, but there does seem to be a number of different people who have a sense that a revival is coming of some sort. One of the things that came through yesterday, and a number of others, both from my own perception and others, have had a strong sense that the revival's coming, but it will be a different type of revival. It won't be going back to what was previously. We give thanks for what has been previously. But for a new generation and a new time, it'll be a different move of the Spirit and the way in which it may manifest itself. No one is quite sure where God was taking us, which is as it should be. I want to focus this morning on a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, which we just had, and in particular one verse within it, which is a familiar verse around we have this treasure in earthen jars or earthen vessels. But I'd like to do it in a way in which the background paints the scene and the passage then speaks for itself. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the passage itself, but we'll say what's going on behind these words of Paul. And to do so, I need to introduce us to the church in Corinth. Now, as Paul was moving around and moved by the Spirit over from his more familiar area around Galatia, he sort of grew up in a region closer to around the Galatian, what became the Galatian churches, over to Philippi and Thessaloniki and Berea, an area known as Macedonia. And if you follow his journeys in the book of Acts, then Paul comes down to Athens and enters into the city of the great philosophers and the philosophical schools, and he finds a voice and gets invited to speak and has the dramatic address to the Areopagus, which is the council of all the great philosophers. And they said, tell us more about this teaching that you have. And we know something of that drama. But we also come to recognise that though Paul's time in Athens was dramatic, he didn't leave a church. It finishes by saying there's a few who believed, and it's almost as though Paul was a bit depressed after that exciting time having spoken to the philosophers. And so Paul moved on to Corinth, which was nearby, about 90 kilometres away. And there's quite a bit of competition between Athens and Corinth back in Paul's time. Athens, if you've ever seen the pictures of it or been there, you'll know they have the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis. It's quite a dramatic sight. If you go to Corinth, the Corinthians would have said, oh, the Athenians, I've told you about the Acropolis and the Parthenon. That's nothing compared. That's a pebble compared to the Acrocorinth. So the Acrocorinth is a great big rock. And Corinth as a city prided itself on being well connected And at this stage, it was a thoroughly Roman city. The Romans actually had rebuilt it after it had been destroyed by some natural disasters under Julius Caesar's time. So Paul was stepping into a Roman city in Greece, but where the partnership between Greece and Rome had flourished. So they were being able to do big building programs and a big theatre, and it was a spectacular newly built city that Paul stepped into. And it seems to us that Paul didn't know anyone in Corinth. In fact, as he was moving towards it, we're told in Acts that God had to lift his spirits and saying, Paul, my people are in that city. They just don't know it yet. And I'm wanting you to go in and to spread the gospel, the good news. So as Paul did so, he came and started off working as a tent maker. So the part of the city where the tradespeople worked, Paul was a leather worker, so he engaged in, amongst the other leather workers, got to know them, and began to tell something of his story. And in that time, we know that he met Priscilla and Aquila, fellow leather workers who were also itinerant, and he formed a friendship. And through that time, people came to hear and responded to the good news about Jesus, the gospel. And so the church in Corinth grew quickly to being one of the standout churches of all the places that Paul had travelled around. This quickly grew into the biggest of the churches, and a number of house churches developed within Corinth. And the house churches were located in socially well-placed people, people who were a part of the city administration, we know were members of the church. And to be able to have a church of 30 people was a really big church, because they were in homes, and very few homes could actually provide hospitality for 30 people. So the number of these churches grew, and there was a great excitement as they discovered the richness of the working of the Spirit. Now, as that continued, and this is a very short version as they went, those house churches began to become a bit competitive of each other, and competitive in terms of who their favoured speakers were. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how he's heard that they are dividing up, and some saying, "We're of Apollos." Apollos is a very articulate person trained in public speaking. And others saying, "Oh, we're Peter." Others saying, "Oh, we're Paul." And others saying a bit more piously, "Oh, we're of Jesus." But they were dividing off and comparing these different styles of leaders over against each other. And each of the leaders would have been horrified by that. And Paul was certainly saying, that is not a healthy way to go. Now, we know from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians that in their excitement, in their growth, and the way in which the Spirit was at work amongst them, they were slipping into that state of pride. The sense of, isn't it wonderful to see how the gifts that are emerging? There's a scene in a book by William Thackeray, which is called Vanity Fair. Not sure if you've ever read the book, but you may possibly have seen either the movie, or there's a wonderful BBC production of Vanity Fair with Michael Palin, has the character of William Thackeray. And the opening scene in this BBC production is set in the time of the Napoleonic Wars and the growth of Britain and England in particular. And the opening scene, as the BBC production does, it has this beautiful scene of a carousel at night in a circus going around and around. And on the carousel are all the main characters who emerge. And then Michael Palin steps in as the role of William Thackeray and says, "Welcome to Vanity Fair." And in that world of the elite of the community, he sees how they parade themselves and present themselves. But behind that facade, the realities of their lives, their anxieties, their fears, and their weaknesses was just below the surface. And in many ways, that is how Paul doesn't use the actual words, but it's pretty close to what Paul was hearing about Corinth. Now, he had 18 months in Corinth, Then he moved over to Ephesus, crossed the water over to Western Turkey. And he spent about 3 years in Ephesus, and again a church grew and spread. But groups from Corinth would come over and report to Paul what's happening back in Corinth. And amongst other things, an anti-Paul party moved in. We know that as Paul travelled around, a group would follow him, and once Paul moved out, they would step in and say, "We know you've heard Paul, and he's a well-meaning old fellow, but he's missing something of the message. And we can fill in the details of what Paul was missing." And then they would add further ways in which they believed God was at work. And they were impressive speakers. They were trained in being able to sway crowds and audiences. In the ancient world, surprise, surprise, they didn't actually have iPhones or didn't have Netflix or all those different types of things. If you wanted to be entertained, you would go down to the forum, the centre of each city. And in the forum, public speakers would have these rhetorical jousts with each other. And they would do it in quite a dramatic way. They'd almost throw out a challenge at another speaker to respond to a question or a challenge. And then they'd have a public debate. And the crowd would gather behind and decide who was the most impressive of these speakers, these personalities. And Paul begins to say, well, Corinth is a pretty proud city. In fact, they think they are the best city. They have the biggest mountain behind them. They have the highest temple. They have all the wealth and are well connected. And Paul says, sadly, it seems as though the church is a lot like the city. The church is feeling as though this is where the Spirit is happening. And Paul in 1 Corinthians talked about, if only I could be the spiritual giants that you are. You display all these gifts, you have all these things happening. You're the big name church that everyone is talking about. And Paul says, unfortunately, I'm down here in the gutter. And he pauses. In 1 Corinthians he says, but mind you, Christ is down here in the gutter as well. That's actually where we're called to be. Why don't you come and join us down here in the gutter? Because that is where God is at work. Now, by the time we get to 2 Corinthians, the criticisms of Paul become more personal. They're saying, look, Paul, you write these strong letters, but when we meet you personally, you're not nearly as impressive. We don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh is. Some actually think he may have had a stutter when he speaks. We don't know exactly, but they say, look, you're not nearly as impressive in person than you are when you write. And there's also a sense in which, Paul, you're missing some stuff. And there's a lot of comparisons being made with a group who are called the super apostles. Who put apostles is the phrase. And Paul talks about, if only I could boast like these super apostles, but if I must boast, he says in 2 Corinthians, I boast about the number of shipwrecks and prisons and beatings and sufferings I have. And they aren't the sort of things you would put on a CV for a self-respecting Christian leader. The number of times I've been taken before the authorities and so on. Paul had also got to the point of saying, I need to come back to Corinth and meet the church face to face. There's some false teaching that needs to be called out. And there are some practices in the life of the church that are not appropriate. They're ungodly practices. And Paul had written a strong letter. So he announced he was going to go back to Corinth. But then as he just started his journey, he actually changed his mind and said, no, look, I think rather than my going back and blowing oxygen into this confrontation and making it potentially even worse, having a really painful visit which will be full of conflict, I'll write a letter and I'll send one of my trusted offsiders, Titus, with the letter. So he changed his plan and he announced, he said, I'll send Titus over with my letter and I hope that you receive him well. I've told Titus that you will receive him well, you know me, and I'm praying like crazy that you'll hear that letter in the spirit in which it's intended. And then Paul continues his journey up to Troas and up to Macedonia, waiting anxiously to hear how Titus has got on. As he's writing 2 Corinthians, he says one of the criticisms has come back already. That is just typical of Paul. He announces he's going to do this trip, and then suddenly, no, his plans have changed and he's now going in another direction. That is just typical of Paul. One thing is this, next thing is that. So Paul was writing 2 Corinthians in a very emotionally raw place. And he's having to defend himself, defending his style of leadership. He doesn't compare with these great orators who get the big crowds. And he's got some harsh things to say that are not right. He's calling people out, and people aren't wanting to hear that. Even more so in Paul's travels, he's just then had a brush with death. Back in chapter 1 of 2 Corinthians, we don't know what it was. It may have been a run-in with the authorities in a time in prison where he thought that he was going to be executed in Ephesus, or it may have been that he had an illness, a really bad illness, and he was convinced that this was it. In the height of the fever, he thought this is going to be it. And to his surprise, he survived. We don't know the details, but Paul is very aware of his mortality. Think about it. Paul has walked something like 16,000 kilometres in his journeys. He's been shipwrecked. He's been beaten multiple times. When you are beaten in the Greek and Roman world, your back does not recover. It carries the scars for life. And it's in that spirit that Paul is trying to remind himself, why is he doing this? It's not an uncommon story. Sadly, it is one that I as a bishop get to hear from time to time, that clergy get to that stage saying, I'm tired, I'm worn out, this is hard work, and I don't really need all this stuff. Paul's message in 2 Corinthians is one that speaks to many pastors and teachers. Back in chapter 2, and I'll just run through as Paul reflects on it. One of the criticisms that has been made is that Paul has come up with an idea that the church back in Jerusalem has been going through a time of famine and poverty. Now, we know about that in that area around Judea at that time. And Paul thought, wouldn't it be a lovely thing if all these other churches that have now been planted because people came out of Jerusalem with a message and became churches, if they did a collection and of their collection took it back to Jerusalem as an offering to the saints in Jerusalem. And initially, the church in Corinth were one of the first to put their hands up and saying, yep, we'll be part of this project, we think it's great. And then the criticisms came. How do you know Paul isn't just going to keep his money for himself? We know that lots of public philosophers and popular speakers and travelling preachers go around, put the hat around and ask for the financial report. Maybe Paul was just like them. Another criticism that's come to Paul. So Paul then says in this letter, you know me, he says. You know how I worked amongst you as a tent maker. Didn't ask for you for anything at that time. You see, we're not like the many hucksters who preach for personal profit, he says. We preach the word of God with sincerity and with Christ's authority, knowing that God is watching us. And then he goes on in the same passage and he says, and to those who are perishing, we are a dreadful smell of death and gloom. But to those who are being saved, we are a life-giving perfume, a life-giving fragrance. At that point, Paul is recognising that as he preaches, not everyone is so impressed with his message. Some react to it strongly. And he says, well, it's actually not me. It's the aroma of Christ that is the presence of God. So if we are praying for the presence of God and the revival, which we certainly are, we need to recognise that that presence will be offensive to some. And it'll cause a pushback. People are saying that presence is a bad odour. Get away from us. Because that's what comes with the presence of Christ around us. And then he finishes with a line where he's actually echoing Moses. You might remember Moses in the book of Exodus. You know, Moses comes to the burning bush, or the bush that's flaming but not burning up. takes off his sandals, comes into that sacred state of God's presence. And Moses hears from God, is saying, look, I've heard the cries of my people back in Egypt. I'm going to go back and I'm going to free them from slavery in Egypt and bring them into a promised land. And Moses responds to God by saying, that is a terrific plan, God. It is so good to know that you're going to go back and free your people. There's one small problem. You've got the wrong person. I'm not the one. And Moses says, I'm not adequate for this task. You might remember how then God provides him with Aaron to assist him. Paul echoes the same words. At this point, he's feeling quite low. And he says, look, at this point, I could move into my retirement plan. It's coming so hard, I'm not sure I continue. Who is adequate for what is being asked of me by God? But he doesn't leave it there. He then moves on and he says, but my adequacy, my capability to do this isn't of myself. Paul knows that. It is what God is doing in and through me, such as I am. That is where my adequacy comes from, my sufficiency. Paul continues as he talks about that adequacy that comes from God, and then he says, and even more so, the big one who, for those who come from the Jewish background, the faith of Israel would say the two great ones of the Old Testament, or the three great ones, Abraham, Moses and David. And Moses is the centrepiece of it. And with Moses, knew what it was to have the presence of God. To come into the presence of God, you might even remember in Exodus 19 as they're coming down to receive or to have received the Ten Commandments. And the people said, no, we can't go into the presence of God. It is too fearful a thing to do. So they said, you go for us. So Moses went and came into the presence of God to receive the commandments. And when he came back down, do you remember what happened? His face was shining so much, they couldn't cope with that. And they said, look, you go into a tent and veil yourself, because having been in the presence of God, your reflected glory is just overwhelming for us. So Moses veiled himself until that faded after being in the presence of God. It's an astonishing feature. Paul says, well, if you think Moses was radiating the presence of God, that light, he says, is like a candle compared to the fullness of the brightness of what emanates from Jesus as the presence of God. Moses glimpsed a candle of it, and he was almost too much. But to experience Jesus is a whole new level of radiance. And he says the message that Jesus brings of the new covenant is so much greater than the message that Moses did, was the first building stone of the message that Jesus was then to bring the fullness of the kingdom into. So Paul was actually saying, we don't go back to Moses, because what we've received in Jesus is so much better and so much brighter. So it is in that sense that Paul comments that not just the person, but the message that we bring, knowing Jesus and what Jesus teaches us about righteousness, is such a glorious thing. Why would you go back to the old ways? So we come to chapter 4. And this is where I'm just going to allow the passage to speak for itself. So Paul has defended his ministry, his calling from God, the message that he brings from Christ. Therefore, since God in his mercy has given us this ministry, Paul's talking about his own ministry, we never give up. We reject all shameful deeds and underhanded methods. We don't try to trick anyone or distort the word of God. We're not trying to manipulate the crowds for a response. We tell the truth before God, and all who are honest know this. But if our gospel is veiled, like Moses, it's veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world, the evil one, is blinding the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of God, who is the face of God. And then he comes to one of those beautiful verses. And Paul says this isn't just talking about some vague truth. He says, this is broken into my life. Elsewhere, he says that I was one of those unbelievers reacting against the message of Jesus, persecuting the church. How did I get it wrong? So Paul says that we're not proclaiming ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lords, and ourselves as your servants, your slaves is actually the word, for Jesus' sake. And then Paul talks about his own experience. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness. And of course, that's the words of creation, but it's all Paul's own experience on the Damascus Road. Paul's encounter with the risen, glorified Christ on the Damascus Road changed everything. This light that shines out of darkness has shone in our hearts to give light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. Isn't it a beautiful phrase? That is the vision that drives us and shapes us. And then Paul comes to this verse that is the more familiar one. Now we have this light, the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. We have this in our hearts. But we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. Paul says, it is true. My physical body is getting old. It is worn, it's beaten. I don't present as the strong, dynamic public figure that people just gravitate around. And Paul recognises that's actually, I'm not going to apologise it for being older, for being weaker, for being battered around the edges, for having my weaknesses and my flaws. Paul doesn't try and defend that. In fact, he says quite the opposite. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not ourselves. The phrase actually says it is necessary. If God's greatness is to be seen, it is necessary that my weakness be evident. If it was that I was a great public presenter, orator, not speaking for myself personally, but for all those, people be talking about the person. The personality politics that we know is just so rife in our world at the moment. And Paul says it's not about the personalities. It's about the ability to convey the giver of the gifts rather than those who have received the gifts. And that is a dangerous trap. Just going to stay with that image that it is in those weaknesses that God's power becomes evident. Now, there are times I've learned since I was a child and perfected as a teenager that if I damaged anything in my home, broke one of those precious jars or things that my mother had, there was an art that I developed, not perfected, but it wasn't too bad, of hiding the breakages. You know, you try and glue it together, you try and do it so that you'd have to go up really close with a magnifying glass to see what the breakage can be. There's an art that I owe this piece that I want to finish with to my wife Fiona. It's Japanese art called kintsugi. And my wife Fiona, who does retreats, used this image in one of her retreats, and it really spoke to me. In this Japanese art of kintsugi, you don't hide the cracks, you make them the feature. And the art is you use a form of epoxy, sometimes it's gum from a tree, and you add some gold or colours to it. So rather than trying to hide and pretend the cracks aren't there, it is those cracks, it is the glue that holds them together that stands out as the feature. And that's not a bad image for how God wants us to present. Don't hide the cracks, don't apologise for them. Say it's precisely God's grace, God's power of putting together the mess and the fractures and all the frailty of my life That is what I'm pointing to, because there we find the hope that is available to every one of us. There is a beauty in that weakness that permeates and shines as God's grace. As we seek to pray for a new working of God's Spirit around us, let us not fall into the Corinthian trap of hoping that it's all going to start with us and it's all going to be about us reaching out and changing all the world, because that's what the Corinthians believed. In fact, they were quite put out when Paul actually denied their request to fund some of his ministry, because he knew it came with strings attached. Let us learn that it's actually in the most unlikely areas of weakness and frailty that the brightness and the richness and the transformative power of God is most evident. May God in his grace take us such as we are, that his light, the treasure, the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, may that be what radiates from each and every one of us. Amen.